Hello and welcome to Politics and Polls. I'm Julian Zelizer, professor of history and politics at Princeton University, and this is my co-host and colleague, Sam.
Hi, I'm Sam Wang, professor of neuroscience and molecular biology and founder of the Princeton Election Consortium. Good day.
Well, the VP sweepstakes are in full swing. We have rumors now on both sides. Hillary Clinton with the question of whether she's going to go for an exciting pick like Elizabeth Warren or Sherrod Brown, who could potentially energize the voters who came out for Bernie Sanders, or is she going to play it safe and go with the quote-unquote boring pick, someone like Senator Tom Kean of Virginia, who might help her with white male voters, but at a minimum wouldn't cost her any voters. For Republicans, I don't think anybody knows where this is going. We've heard some names like Chris Christie and Newt Gingrich, former Speaker of the House, are said to be at the top of the list, while other prominent figures like Bob Corker and Joni Ernst have suggested they're no longer in the running after being very prominent. And Trump seems to be running this a little bit like a reality show. It's the new version of The Apprentice, where someone might be getting fired right up to the convention. So with all this, we're wondering, does the vice presidential running mate, does the VP pick even matter anymore? Back in the day, it used to be a way to bring some regional balance to the ticket. John F. Kennedy famously picked Lyndon Johnson in 1960 as a way to make sure that he won in Texas and did well in the South, but it's really not clear in 2016 what the function of the VP is. So we thought this might be a good place to start our conversation.
Well, Julian, I'm curious about your thoughts about historical precedents. I mean, one hears about VP selections carrying a state or not carrying a state. From the historian's perspective, can you think of a situation where a whole bunch of states were won by a VP choice? Because it seems to me like, I don't know, like somebody like Joe Biden, it's not like Delaware was in all that much suspense 8 years ago, you know? So
Yeah.
When can we think of a case where it really mattered a lot? 20th century, earlier?
I can't think of anything, certainly since 1960, where the VP pick had that effect. I do think Johnson was more important than just Texas, and a lot of the southern states didn't have good feeling about John F. Kennedy. And so I think he's an example of where it was beyond a state. He helped with the region, but I don't think there is a case to be made about the regional benefits, certainly in the modern period, in the post-1960s period. Even you could argue that Clinton, and who ran with Al Gore in 1992, and part of the idea was they would help bring the South back to the Democratic Party. It's not clear that Al Gore from Tennessee really had the effect. So I don't know. When I talk about this, it seems like we're certainly have to delve back into early 20th century, 19th century history, when the VP pick was something very different. Once the conventions were gone, it just doesn't seem to matter in that way anymore. I don't know. I mean, I don't know if you see any evidence of any kind of regional effect anymore in the past few decades.
Well, when did it start being the case that the VP and president had to be from the same party?
Oh, well, that goes back.
How long ago?
I mean, we don't have any example of kind of bipartisan ticket that we can think of recently. That's an assumption that both parties are making. There was some talk of John McCain, I believe, in 2008, potentially doing something bold with someone like a Lieberman and trying to bring back a bipartisan ticket, but I don't think it had any kind of serious consideration. Given what we've talked about with the electorate, it seems like that would just be a disastrous move. The biggest variation you have is like in '76, when Ronald Reagan selects a liberal Republican, Schweiker, from Pennsylvania, with the idea that you would balance right and center, but not balance the two parties anymore.
Well, McCain did do something bold. He did pick Sarah Palin. And as far as I can tell, looking at the dynamics and ups and downs of a campaign once it started, it looks like there's some natural set point to a campaign from the beginning And what campaigns seem to be engaged in is trying to move things towards or away from that natural place where the electorate would like to go, quote unquote. So if you look at what McCain did in selecting Sarah Palin, in retrospect, it looks disastrous, but honestly, the one time when McCain was competitive with Obama in the Electoral College and in state polls and in national polls was basically the week after the Republican convention, when Palin electrified the convention, put aside whatever we know about her now. She seemed really fresh, and there was something about her that made it seem like for about a week, McCain's Hail Mary pass had really worked.
Do you think that week matters? I remember that. I remember how well she does it. It's funny, a VP pick like that in retrospect seems horrible, but you can remember at the convention how it was a little electricity in the air and it was new. But I don't know. Do you think a week like that could have had an effect on 2008, given the financial crisis and where George Bush's reputation was?
Well, there's a broader question, which is, from my point of view, following numerical data, there is the question of whether any of these state polls mean anything at all, because there's only one moment when we actually get to validate what the polls mean, which is on election day. And all these other times when state polls move up and down, they're measuring some mood, some feeling among voters. And I guess the way I would put it is, there's a place where that campaign was headed based on economic factors, based on approval of the incumbent president. It was headed all along. If you look at it, the numbers were bouncing up and down around some equilibrium of Obama winning by about the amount that he ended up winning by, about 7 percentage points in the popular vote, 365 electoral votes, if I remember correctly. And so that up and down movement looks like it was like almost attached by a spring to some natural outcome. And what I was getting at before is, you think about campaigns as trying to get things off of that natural point, it's like they're pulling on that spring and trying to get it to go someplace. And so what I was getting at was that, if it had lasted, then it would have mattered. And it didn't last. It lasted about a week or two. And then when she got interviewed by Charlie Gibson, that didn't go so well. And so I think that a lot of what campaigns are doing is kind of trying to shake things up a little bit and get things to go someplace. So, in some deep sense, I think you're right, it didn't matter. But to the extent that anything was going to happen, the one moment when it looked like it was going to happen was when she was in her honeymoon period. But let me pivot a little bit to this year. One way in which I think the VP pick I could imagine mattering, and this is total speculation, is honestly with members of one's own party. I mean, let's stick with the Republicans for a minute. There are more undecideds this year at this point than there were 4 years ago. So if you look 4 years ago in July 2012, a little less than 91% of respondents in polls said that they preferred either Obama or Romney. So if you added up their two support. And right now, that total, the Clinton plus Trump total, is currently 85%. So it seems like there are more uncommitted voters right now. And if you drill into it a little bit, it looks like those uncommitted voters are greater in number in red states, in places that Romney won. And so Trump is doing something like anywhere between 2 points worse than Romney in North Carolina to more like 30 plus points worse in Utah and 25 points worse in Kansas. So there are these places in the U.S. where Republican voters really have not cottoned to Donald Trump. And I don't know, maybe he should just pick some regular, normal Republican, because we all know he'll do the normal, regular thing. And
I assume that's probably a little bit of why Newt Gingrich is appealing to him.
Oh, yeah.
With all of Gingrich's scandals and controversy, he is a senior Republican. If there's some kind of Republican establishment, he might serve some of that purpose, just to give confidence. I see him to give confidence to Republican voters that this guy is really going to be with the GOP, and he'll understand what the party game plan is.
He's not real popular with the general public. I mean, there was talk once about him running for president, which overlooked the fact that he's horrifically unpopular with the general population. But on the other hand, from a Republican Party point of view, I mean, if one were trying to save them from the the worst possible outcome. A really bad outcome would be depressed turnout and bummed out voters in red states. And so you can imagine, I don't know, you can imagine Gingrich keeping the floor from dropping out in these places that I mentioned before, places where there's a lot of muttering among Republican voters that they just don't like this guy.
I mean, it seems with Trump, it's interesting what you're saying. For each candidate, there's a very different purpose, clearly, in this VP pick. And so for Trump, part of it is simply to give voters confidence, all voters confidence, that this is a White House that will be able to handle the job. But part of it is what you're saying within the Republican Party, the need to solidify some of this depressed data that a Republican might be seeing about Trump to prevent the worst possible scenario, or to at least make sure that you're competitive in the states the Republicans are hoping to play ball in. And so that would lead you to pick a respectable Republican who can govern. I assume another part of it is to raise money, although now Trump is doing a little bit better. He still doesn't have the support of all the Koch brother kind of donors, and so the right pick might help him with that. Certainly, for a while they were talking about Joni Ernst as someone who's a Koch brother product from Iowa, and someone who could help give them confidence to give money. But I assume that's another part of what he wants to do. It's unclear if he cares about picking someone who will balance some of the perception of him being too hard on immigration and too out there with some of his rhetoric.
Well, just backing up a little bit. So there's the particulars of who Trump and Hillary Clinton will each pick for vice president. But what do presidential candidates look for now? How's the vice presidency different now from, say, when Kennedy was running?
Well, I think that the major difference is this regional balance or regional part of the pick has fallen away. I don't think there's many campaigns that really believe that this is something that a VP pick could do. So picking Sherrod Brown isn't necessarily going to bring you a state like Ohio, and it certainly won't swing more than a state, and it won't even do that. It's clear that it seems part of what they're doing now is in part a pick for how the media is going to cover the pick and what it says about the campaign. And these campaigns are about building a story about a candidate that is then sold post-convention. And the VP pick is a small part of that. So you're either trying to balance out weaknesses in how people talk and see a candidate or enhance a storyline. So Elizabeth Warren would be important for a Hillary Clinton in solidifying a perception, not simply that she's too conservative, but that she is going to be part of a White House committed to the progressive policies and ideals that a lot of the Democratic electorate wants. And so I think that's important. I do think one part of the whole discussion that no one seems to have is the actual role that the VP will have as a policymaker. So we have this historical irony that as the pick became less important to campaigns since the 70s, the VP itself has become a much more powerful office. And we've seen people from Walter Mondale, who was Jimmy Carter's VP, to Dick Cheney under George Bush, to Biden, who are really formidable policymakers now, both on Capitol Hill and within the executive branch. And that's one factor. I don't know how much the campaigns think about that. I assume they do. Sanders would be important, not just for bringing in votes right now, but also in part for what she could do on regulatory policy, economic policy, and a relationship with liberals on the Hill. That's where I think the campaigns are thinking. And obviously, even though Palin had that bump, I do think she has an effect in that the campaigns are going to be very careful. They are careful in this day and age with the safety factor. They don't want to have a pick that hurts the campaign. And that then becomes part of the criteria that they're looking for. Trump's a little different. This Trump campaign is just a little different in that his candidacy and campaign, as you said, are so out there. They're so disassociated from what campaigns have been that he might think of this pick in a different way. And I don't know. I have no insight into the thinking of Donald Trump or the people who surround him. But there might be a different kind of use that he has. The last thing is that the attack dog. This is something Richard Nixon famously did when he ran with Eisenhower in 1952 as the vice presidential pick. And you pick someone who will say everything that the main candidate can't say. Again, in the case of Donald Trump, that function doesn't seem necessary. But that has been part of what we look for in VPs.
But one thing that a VP pick could say that he's not going to say is that VP pick could talk about normal policy issues and normal policy positions. And so that's a thing that Trump is not really doing. So
you have the main candidate as the attack dog, and then the vice presidential person could be the person who can talk policy.
Yeah. I was just looking at Larry Sabado's crystal ball, and Joel Goldstein, a VP scholar, has written about this, and he pointed out that a lot of VP picks are DC insiders, people like Joe Biden, Paul Ryan, Dick Cheney. And so I want to raise kind of I think from a horse race perspective, a somewhat radical point, which is, what about the idea, do we have any evidence that campaigns pick the vice presidential candidate by the criterion of who could be president in case something happened to the president? Is that, I mean, I don't want to sound too crazy here, but what about that as a criterion?
I think that's a criteria, don't you? It can't be that they don't think about that. At the most basic level, in the post 9/11 age, it's part of what you're going to be thinking about. But it also matters at some level probably to voters. You don't want to have someone running with you who doesn't seem to be capable of handling the job not just of vice president but of president. So I assume, certainly in the Clinton campaign, that's part of what they think about. Not simply for if it happens, but you don't want voters to be thinking, oh my God, if something happens horrific to our president, this is who's going to be in office. I do think that certainly was what, once the Sarah Palin interviews came, that was part of what hurt the ticket. Obviously, there were many other things, but you don't want a candidate like that. So I assume the candidates think about that, and that might be part of why there's an insider bias. I don't think that's the only reason. I think these campaigns want people who can work with Capitol Hill. We now are in an age where executive power is so extensive, and presidents tend to rely on that because Congress isn't going to pass much legislation. They want people who understand how to use executive power effectively, and that's usually people who've been in Washington for a while. You don't want a novice to deal with executive orders and working with the agencies and trying to kind of use your muscle that way. So I assume all of that is added to thinking about who could actually be president. Although maybe again this year that won't matter. But that's an interesting trend, especially given all this anti-Washington rhetoric that we've been hearing about in the campaign.
Yeah, I don't know. I think after all that rhetoric, I mean, if you look at the VP candidates that I can think of, I mean, just going back in time, Biden, Paul Ryan, Sarah Palin was an outsider in a very outsidey way, as she would put it. Dick Cheney, John Edwards. I mean, these are all people who are creatures of Washington. They're like, they work in Washington for a living. I guess one thing I would think is, just to step away from politics a little bit, as an expert in a domain, I have this view that expertise is underrated, and I have to object just as a citizen to the idea that we should want people who have never done a thing before to do that before. I don't want my pilots to be novices. I don't want my surgeon to be a novice. I don't know. I think there's some merit to the idea that maybe someone who's actually been engaged in government might be a good person to operate government.
I agree. That's an argument against term limits in Congress, and there's an idea that if you have fresh people all the time, it will somehow be better. And there is something to incumbency in Congress, and there's something to understanding how a system works. And you're right, it's the only profession. There's this huge demand to have people who don't actually know what they're doing run the show. That's obviously part. It's not simply in politics. There is a anti-expertise feeling that has swept through a lot of American culture in the last few decades. Partly a post-Vietnam, partly a post-Watergate era phenomenon where we started to distrust our institutions. But I do think in politics it can be a problem, and it is interesting that that's not always who the VP people are that we've been running with. And I do think that's important in this campaign where this anti-establishment rhetoric is so pronounced, and there's this belief in the person who's in the system so much can't be better at actually working politically. That can have dangerous effects.
Let me make one suggestion, which is if you look at states where Trump is weak right now, I mean, he probably would not admit to weakness in any way, but if you look at states where he's weak, it's places like Utah and Kansas that he lost to Ted Cruz. And if I recall correctly, Cruz has made it pretty clear that he doesn't want to place on the ticket. But I still, seems like that might not be a bad choice to pick somebody who's actually popular in these places where Trump is not so popular.
Do you think someone like that would actually go for it? How bad do you think this problem is that he's facing of people not wanting to run with him?
Yeah, the news is that they're all saying no. I think recently Bob Corker, Senator Corker, said he didn't want to do it. He said, hey, I think was it him who said, he was like, how about Ivanka? So we have a Trump and Trump ticket.
Right.
I mean.
That would be new. Hey, do you think the one thing
pretty soon.
I wanted to ask you, do you think, so back to the Clinton side, the argument is that she needs to win over all these Bernie Sanders voters. Do you think it's possible from what you've seen of who is voting for him that the VP pick does matter? Is Elizabeth Sanders, say she picks her, is that the kind of move that could actually ensure voters are going to come in, or are these voters who are probably going to vote anyway for Hillary Clinton given this campaign?
I have a hard time believing, the passions run hot during primary season, and we always have this recency effect where we really remember what's happening now or a few weeks ago. And I think despite all this talk about Sanders voters not going for Clinton, honestly, I would be pretty surprised if they didn't, for the most part, come back, at least the ones who were Democrats or Democratic-leaning independents. There's a survey from YouGov that pointed out about a month ago that something like a third of Sanders supporters appeared to be actually Republicans. And that's an interesting group, right? If that group really exists in those numbers, then one question is, could one get those crossover voters? But right now, Hillary Clinton is only running an average of about 1.9 percentage points behind where Obama finished 4 years ago, and that's in 22 states where there's polling data available. So overall, it doesn't look like Hillary Clinton is that far behind where Obama was in 2012. So, maybe there'll be some effect, but I think we'll never know. I think to some extent, from a public perceptions point of view, is Sanders going to get anything for holding out so long? I feel like people don't care about that anymore. But anyway, as I said, numerically, Clinton seems to be about where Obama was.
And if that Republican number is correct, it might not be Warren that would be the person who would convince those voters to join the ticket. I mean, it's not clear.
Yeah, it is probably, given the current polarization of politics, it is probably not the case that all those 21% of voters in Kansas who are undecided, they don't seem like they're getting ready to vote for a Democrat. But it's really striking that there are states like Utah, Kansas, Missouri, Arizona. These states are within 10 points. And I don't think anybody would have guessed a year ago that Kansas would be a state that was within a couple of percentage points among decided voters. And so I think the best the Republicans can hope for is probably for those voters to come home to the Republican Party. But given Hillary Clinton's negatives among Republicans, it's not at all clear that those voters are within reach for her campaign.
Do you think, given your expertise, that it is possible for a candidate to deliver a single state? I mean, as I said, I'm skeptical that that function works anymore. But is it, given we're talking about an election where single states matter, or at least a period in American politics where one state, like Florida, is decisive, do you think it is possible? Is that conventional wisdom wrong, that it doesn't matter anymore?
Well, I guess the reputation, it's probably best to think of these things quantitatively, right? So, for instance, people talk about Gore losing his home state of Tennessee, but Tennessee is a pretty strongly Republican state, and so it's there's been analysis that suggests that a VP pick might be worth a smaller amount for his or her home state. So, for instance, in a state like Ohio, where Clinton is currently ahead by 4 points, if that were pretty tight, then it might be worthwhile to pick somebody who could boost that by, say, 5 or 10 points. I don't know. I guess given where I think the presidential campaign is headed, I mean, it seems like Clinton's got a narrow lead, and we'll see whether that holds up. But one might even consider down ticket effects like where are there going to be close House races? Where is there going to be a close Senate race? And is it possible that one could boost turnout for one's own side by a few points in that state, right? And so I think that at this point, one should not neglect the effect of down ticket effects. And, 5 points might not make a big difference in a state where one party was already ahead, but it could make a pretty significant difference, say, for turnout in House races or in the Senate race.
And of course, Harry Reid's making it clear he would prefer not to lose a Senate seat with the vice presidential pick, so that she doesn't pick a senator who would probably be replaced by a Republican because of the challenges Democrats are anticipating dealing with Congress. That's clearly going to be another factor in the Clinton campaign.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's too early to tell right now because many of the nominees have not been established. But Senate control could go either way. And let's not forget that in 2 years, let's say hypothetically that Hillary Clinton becomes president, there are midterm elections coming up in 2 years, and the president's party usually loses seats. And whatever happens this November in the Senate or in the House, that party that it occupies the White House is likely to lose gains. And so in the situation where the Democrats control the White House, those seats are going to matter in 2018. And so I think that Reid is making a pretty strategic statement there.
Well, that actually wraps up our episode. So I hope everyone can join us next week where we'll continue with our discussion. And thanks for joining us. And we'll be back on Politics and Polls.
Take care, everybody.